Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Michelle Amazeen as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Michelle is the Associate Dean of Research, Associate Professor of Mass Communication, and Director of the Communication Research Center at Boston University's College of Communication. Dr. Michelle's research examines persuasion and misinformation, focusing on how false or misleading content influences audiences and how corrective interventions can counter those effects. Employing both qualitative and quantitative methods, Dr. Amazeen produces research with tangible applications for journalists, educators, policymakers, and media consumers, helping them better identify, analyze, and resist persuasive misinformation in today's complex media environment. Dr. Amazeen is one of only 22 prominent scholars worldwide who contributed to the Debunking Handbook 2020. Since 2021, she has been recognized among the top 2% most highly cited researchers globally by Stanford University. Her work has been published in leading academic journals and cited in over 60 policy documents worldwide. She has also served as an expert contributor to organizations such as the Australian Academy of Science, the European Research Council, and the US Institute for Museum and Library Services, and has presented her findings to agencies including the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Food and Drug Administration. Currently, Dr. Amazeen is a co-investigator on the Boston University Climate Disinformation Initiative, where her work examines climate issues in native advertising. In today's conversation, Dr. Michelle Amazeen dives into the main ideas from her widely praised book, Content Confusion: News Media, Native Advertising, and Policy in an Era of Disinformation. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Amazeen to the conversation. Dr. Michelle, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you so much, Deepak. I'm pleased to be with you.
Thank you. Professor, from your research, what was the single most surprising way in which major news organizations themselves are now aiding in the deception of audiences through native advertising rather than merely being influenced by advertisers as in earlier eras?
So I'm most surprised that news outlets are now creating the ads in-house. So no longer are they simply serving ads no longer are the news outlets serving as a distribution channel through which advertisers can reach their readers. Now they have these in-house content studios that are creating the ads on behalf of paying advertisers. And if you don't mind, I'd like to be able to share with your viewers an example of a native advertisement, just so they can see what I'm talking about.
Sure.
So this is an example here of a native advertisement that ran in the New York Times. You can see the New York Times masthead at the top. There is a disclosure that says paid post. This content was paid for by ExxonMobil. And you can see over to the left, there's the ExxonMobil logo. But if you scroll down, it looks just like a typical news article in the New York Times. You have your multimedia graphics, great images. So this is an example of a native advertisement that news outlets are now creating for many different clients. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so what surprises me is by doing this, the news organizations are opening themselves up to a new form of risk, because this is commercial speech. Right? It's not editorial speech, which is protected by the First Amendment. Commercial speech has much less protections. And so this particular native ad that I just shared with you It's actually an exhibit in a lawsuit that was put forth in 2019, brought by the state of Massachusetts against ExxonMobil, purportedly for deceiving consumers and investors. And, this is a risk for the New York Times now. They are an example in this lawsuit. So that surprises me.
Professor, you trace a historical arc from party press subsidies to advertising funded journalism to today's native ads. Where do you see the decisive turning point at which commercial logics clearly overlook the public trusting model of news?
So I think the inflection point was decades ago, probably during the deregulatory era of the 1980s in the United States. So in the early to mid 20th century in the United States, the journalism industry was professionalizing. It was trying to distinguish itself from public relations and from advertising. And so during this time, there were professional organizations that were established, such as the Society for Professional Journalists and the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And with these professional organizations came codes of ethical practice that they enshrined. And one thing that these codes did was enshrine or establish a theoretical boundary, a separation between the editorial side of journalism and the business side or advertising. And so this is the so-called wall that separated the two. There were also other regulations in the media industry in the United States, such as involving ownership of newspapers and broadcast stations within the same city. So there was a limit on the number of stations or newspapers that could be owned by the same organization in attempt to provide a diverse set of voices. But over the years, as technologies have advanced and brought cable and then satellite television, there was no longer a scarcity of media options that needed protection. So these regulations were relaxed over time, starting about in the 1980s. These regulations were relaxed to presumably spur on more marketplace competition. But that didn't really ever come to pass. There was so much media consolidation instead. And so today you have just a handful of media conglomerates that control a vast majority of what we see and hear. And these companies are driven entirely by a profit motive. So we've moved away from the public interest to a profit-oriented interest.
Professor, in the book you describe how native advertising lets publishers give audiences what they want rather than what they need for self-governance. What does your evidence suggest this tension is going to the quality of democratic deliberation?
So I could answer this in a few different ways. So what audiences want, in part, they don't want to be bombarded with advertising. So since the emergence of the internet, now there's banner ads, there's flashing ads, there's pop-up ads, and people have put on their computers ad blockers so that they don't have to deal with all that. And native advertising is one way that publishers have been able to covertly serve ads to readers, right? So they don't interrupt the flow of what you're doing. Many consumers don't realize when they're looking at native advertising. So it improves the reading experiences for the public, and often it gets around the ad blockers. The ad blockers don't always filter out the native advertisements. And so this affects democratic deliberation. Democratic deliberation is being warped by the self-interest of the advertisers and the profit motive of the publishers. And so I can give you some recent examples. At the beginning of January 2026, I'm sure most of your viewers have heard about how the United States President Trump's administration authorized military force to apprehend the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, supposedly because of drug trafficking. However, many journalistic reports have indicated that the oil reserves in Venezuela also played a part in this. It's the largest set of oil reserves in the world. And the only U.S. oil company that's still operating in Venezuela at this time is Chevron. And the coverage of Chevron in the New York Times since the military action has been very uncritical and even laudatory. There were several articles that came out about the military action in Venezuela. And one of the pieces from the New York Times was effusive about Chevron. So there was an article titled, "How Chevron Aims to Tap More Oil Below Kazakhstan's Grassy Plains." And there was no scrutiny about any environmental impacts, any social impacts. It is mostly from a business perspective. So several articles like this, some talking about what's happening in Venezuela. And then I can also point to this past week in the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing oral arguments about a case in Louisiana. So it is the Chevron USA versus the Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana. And so the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments on earlier this week concerning whether oil companies, especially Chevron, so the name of the case is Chevron, whether that their cases can be removed from the local level and whether it has to go to federal courts rather than state courts. And so there's been some coverage of this in the New York Times. But again, the mentions have been very few about Chevron. They covered this case at the state level back in April 2025, and it was much more in depth. Their coverage now has been very superficial, very focused on just the details about how court cases work and policies and that sort of thing. Very little focus on Chevron. And so what's the difference? What happened between April 2025 and the coverage they're doing now? Well, what happened is the New York Times has partnered with Chevron to create native advertisements for them. So there's an active native advertisement running for Chevron right now. And so this is anecdotal evidence that the coverage, the journalistic coverage of the New York Times has been softened because they have a conflict of interest. How do you hold to account a corporate entity that you have a partnership with to create an ad campaign that makes them look good? So it's a conflict of interest. And we see here, in this case, how it's affecting the coverage of the New York Times in their journalism.
Dr. Michelle, your case studies of Philip Morris and fossil fuel companies show how legacy news brand can be used to manufacture doubt redux. What specific editorial firewalls or policies would you like to see newsrooms adopt to prevent this kind of scientific and climate denialism laundering?
So first, I'd like to see news outlets follow and enforce their own professional codes of ethics that I mentioned previously. These codes discourage the blurring of advertising and editorial content. So from the American Society of Magazine Editors, the ASME, They had a code that said advertisements that mimic the look and feel of the print or digital publication in which they appear may deceive readers and should be avoided. So that was one of their codes in 2015. That has since been watered down. Similarly, at the federal level, I'd like to see the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, that's the regulatory agency in the United States that regulates commerce. I'd like to see the FTC enforce its 1968 advisory, which I have in the book. But this advisory said, it is in the public interest that publishers and advertisers avoid any possible deception by not placing advertisements whose format simulates that of a news or feature article. And that's been ignored. So I would like to see that reinforced. And lastly, I think that the disclosure language requirements, which are provided by the Federal Trade Commission, I think the disclosure language requirements for any type of advertising needs to be standardized. Right now, there's no standardization. The disclosures can say anything, and that's leading to some of the confusion because consumers don't always know what paid post means or partner content. I think it needs to be standardized, going back to the 1968 advisory of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission stating either advertisement or ad.
Professor, you argue that audiences often cannot distinguish native ads from journalism, and that exposure can reduce perceived credibility of real news in the same outlet. What design or disclosure experiment did you find most promising and most disappointing in the empirical literature you reviewed?
Yeah. So the literature that I reviewed, a lot of these were my own experiments that I did, but also other scholars. So I collaborated with some scholars. One scholar that I collaborated with was Bart Wodinsky. So we published a study in 2020 that I found very promising. So we found that when people are exposed to native advertisements, their recognition of them increases when the disclosures use clear language that people understand, such as ad, as I just said, rather than partner content. And also when these disclosures are visually prominent, easy to see, and when these disclosures include a sponsor's logo. So these things lead to greater transparency. And we also found in our work together that people react less negatively to native advertising when the disclosures were perceived as being more transparent or understandable to the audience. So that's promising. And there's another scholar, Simone Crowher. She's done some work with colleagues testing enhanced disclosures. So these are explanatory. If you hover your cursor over it, they'll give you an explanation of what this is and why it's being done. And what they found is that better identification of the native advertising helps people recognize it more, but also leads to less resistance among consumers. So that's promising. Another area of promise that I found in a recent study that was published, it didn't make it into the book. It was from the summer of 2025. So a study called The Future of Energy that I collaborated on. It was another experiment where we've tested different ways to help people become more resilient and able to recognize native advertising. And what we found is that by forewarning people or inoculating them against hidden advertising, it helped them be more likely to be able to recognize native advertisements when they encountered them. And it also shows that the influence of the claims that were made in the native ads reduced their influence. So if in this particular case that we tested, the native advertisement
was positioning the fossil fuel company, it was ExxonMobil in this case, as becoming more environmentally friendly. And we found that when we exposed some of our participants to a forewarning saying, hey, there's this practice called native advertising, and here's what it is, and here's what it does, those people were more likely to recognize that native advertisement for what it was, a paid commercial message rather than a journalistic article. And they were less likely to perceive ExxonMobil as becoming more environmentally friendly in comparison with participants who didn't receive that forewarning and were less likely to understand that that was paid content. More of them thought it was a real piece of journalism. So I think those things are promising. You also asked about disappointing. So over and over again, even with disclosures that are seemingly well designed, still many people don't notice them, and therefore they're deceived by this type of content. So that's disappointing. That's been disappointing to me.
Professor, the book talks about pink slime, local news and utility-funded pseudo outlets as filling news deserts. How should regulators and platforms draw a practical line between legitimate partisan or advocacy journalism and deceptive astroturf news operations?
This is a great question. At least in the United States, it's buyer beware or media consumers beware. There's no regulation of this at any level due to both the First Amendment of our Constitution, which provides free speech protections. And then we also have Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Section 230 shields platforms from any responsibility for user-generated content. So, I mean, you can have anybody post something and claim that it's journalism, right? There's no licensing requirement to be a journalist. And even on many of the large social media platforms, I'm thinking of Facebook, you can register your company as a news outlet, even if it's not. For a short while, there were badges or icons that identified supposed news outlets. I'm thinking of on Twitter. But that designation, when Elon Musk took over, that designation went away, but then he reestablished it, and you could get a special badge if you paid for it. So again, anybody could say that I want a badge showing that I'm a legitimate journalist. That does, if you pay to play, then that system doesn't work. Facebook does have a news page index that's supposed to register and identify legitimate news outlets, but I mean, that needs to be enforced. It hasn't been consistently enforced. It hasn't been effective, I don't think. So in the book, I have several examples of illegitimate outlets registering as news. So, if the platforms put proper resources and attention to this could be achieved. But that's costly. It takes time and effort. And our platforms are incentive by the profit motive, right? Not the public interest, as we were talking about. So until that changes, I don't see that improving.
Professor, you highlight examples where local TV hosts promote dubious medical products in sponsored segments that are later repurposed as news clips online. What responsibility do broadcast regulators and professional associations have here that they are currently failing to meet?
Yeah. So an example on my book is the Venus veil is one of the products that you're referring to. And this was positioned as a sexual wellness blanket. And this was a completely made up product by John Oliver, the comedian. And his team was able to get it on several local news stations and had one of the newscasters talking with one of their representatives about what this Venus veil is supposed to do. And it was all bogus. So, again, this is another example of how our profit-driven media system is superseding the public interest. It's time-consuming, it's expensive to come up with interesting, informative, and engaging media content. It's much easier and cheaper to have advertisers covertly subsidizing your programming with all the stuff they want to sell. And more, that's what we're seeing. I was at my mother's house a couple weeks ago. My mom is 90 years old. And when I arrived, she was watching a daytime television talk show. I think it was the Jennifer Hudson show. And in one segment, they had QR codes up on the screen so that viewers could purchase the products that they were discussing. And my mom, she had read my book. She said, "Michelle, that's just like what's in your book." I'm like, "Yes, Mom. This is essentially a commercial that you're watching." And so the broadcasters and the regulators and the professional associations too, they've loosened their standards over the years so that this sort of commercial blurring with programming content is now commonplace. So it would be really costly and unprofitable to try and enforce this and change this back.
Professor, on the policy side, you examine tools from FTC enforcement to international self-regulatory codes and new tax credit bills for local journalism. Which concrete policy levers strike you as both politically feasible and capable of materially reducing content confusion in the next decade?
So, at least in the US, unfortunately, I see no signs of commercial regulation on the horizon. The current administration, your viewers probably have heard that we have defunded our public media broadcasting corporation. So we're going in the wrong direction. We can't seem to pass any sort of legislation regarding social media harms, much less AI and deepfakes. So, I'm pessimistic in the US. Where I think there's some optimism is in the EU. So they have their Digital Services Act, which requires platforms to be more transparent about how their algorithms and advertising recommendation systems operate. And that includes creating a digital repository or a library of the online ads that are being served. And the purpose of this online library is to allow researchers to study them. And so in this spirit, I have created what I call a native advertising observatory. It's a collection of native advertisements from major news outlets that I'm going to make publicly available to researchers. We're still in the building stage right now. I'm beginning this endeavor on behalf of ads created for the fossil fuel industry. And then I'm going to expand this out to other industries such as utilities, technology, et cetera. And so I'm well on the way with a team. We're building this repository of ads to allow researchers to study, what's in these ads, what are they saying, and then also maybe compare whether it's affecting news coverage. And I'm also soliciting donations from the public of links to any native ads they may have come across that we can add to our database. And so your viewers, if I can encourage them to help me on my website, I have a website. It's my personal website. It's michelleamazeen.com. There's a tab on my website called Data Donation. And so they can go to that tab and fill out this form to point me to a native ad that they may have seen that they want to include in the database. Beyond that, I would say there's also some promise in the United States at the state level in terms of media literacy education, especially in places like Illinois and New Jersey. And there's also countries around the world that are really excelling in this area. Finland comes to mind. They have an excellent media literacy education system for children as young as 5 years old, I think. Many of the Scandinavian countries, France, Canada. So I think media literacy is an area that has some promise as well.
Professor, you advocate for robust media literacy education that explicitly includes native advertising, algorithms, and hidden sponsorship. Based on current school and library initiatives you studied, what does an actually effective media literacy curriculum look like in practice?
Yeah, so it's integrated across all grade levels, every subject. That would be fantastic. So it's hands-on, it's inquiry-based, and the hope is that it would equip students with skills to be able to access different types of media content, analyze that content, evaluate it, know how to create media content, using all different forms of communication. So it's not like a one-off or a standalone set of lessons on fake news, for example, but it needs to be comprehensive across the curriculum, integrating critical thinking skills, and it needs to be continuously practiced and applied to real-world media using real-world examples. I think that would be fantastic.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. In the conclusion, you argue that native advertising has become a catalyst of information pollution and call for strengthening public service and non-profit media that reject or tightly limit advertising. What realistic business and government models have you seen that allow such outlets to remain independent, diverse, and financially sustainable?
So I think there's some examples. I think there's some successful examples of nonprofit news outlets that we can look to. In the United States, there's examples such as ProPublica is one example, Mother Jones, the Texas Tribune. So these are national nonprofit news outlets. There's also some specialized nonprofit news outlets, such as the Marshall Project, which focuses specifically on criminal justice. There's an outlet called The 19th, which focuses on politics and gender. And so these outlets do public service journalism that's filling the gaps left by the commercial media. And they're getting their funding from an array of sources, such as foundations. Individuals can make donations to these groups. Even some tech companies are making donations. Beyond those individual outlets, there's also some institutes. So the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, that's a nonprofit organization that's trying to strengthen local news by funding innovation, sharing best practices, and helping news organizations build sustainable business models. They've been operating primarily in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, but they are doing some stuff nationally, I believe, offering grants, training, collaborative projects. So I think too, news outlets to be successful need to be thinking about how to diversify their revenue streams. So not just relying on advertising. Subscriptions are important. Philanthropy, getting donations from foundations, hosting events. There's some news outlets that are doing that too. So hosting events where they may have their journalists come talk to audiences about what they're doing, and they can charge for that to generate some revenue. Games, some like the New York Times, they've acquired many games that have been very profitable for them, I think. So trying to diversify revenue sources is really important. It's going to be different for every news outlet. There's no one size fits all that's going to be the same for every news outlet. You have to stay focused on understanding your audience. And again, diversification is key.
Listeners, thank you for all joining us for this rich and timely conversation on content confusion and the shifting relationship between journalism, advertising, and democracy. Today's discussion has reminded us that what may look like neutral information on a screen is often shaped by powerful commercial and political interest. From native advertising in legacy newsroom to pink slime local outlets and greenwashed climate narratives. As we conclude, the task before us as educators, practitioners, and citizens is to keep asking who funds each message, whose interest in advances, and how we can safeguard spaces for truly independent, public-spirited journalism. On behalf of our audience, thank you, Professor Michelle Amazeen, for helping us to see how content confusion is produced and how urgently we need better policy, stronger newsroom norms, and deeper media literacy to confront it. And thank you, our audience, for your thoughtful engagement. May this session be a starting point for further research, teaching, and practice that strengthen both our media ecosystem and our democracy. Thank you once again, Professor Michelle Amazeen.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It's been my pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.